After World War II, America stood at the top of the world. No war on its soil. No enemy at its borders. An entire generation grew up believing that tragedy happened somewhere else. Then one day, fear knocked inside America itself. Not a battlefield. Not a border, New York. After World War II, America stood at the top of the world. Not the kind of victory that comes from merely surviving, but the kind that made the entire planet turn and look. Factories that once poured out tanks, aircraft, and ammunition shifted their rhythm, now releasing gleaming automobiles, spotless white refrigerators, radios singing in living rooms. At night, cities lit up like artificial galaxies. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles rising higher, glowing brighter, confident enough to seem as if they would never go dark. Economy, military, influence. Those words were no longer ideas confined to textbooks. They appeared on maps, echoed in speeches, filled cargo ports stacked with goods, and rolled forward on the steady hum of newly built highways. The dollar traveled far. The flag traveled far. And America's voice, whether at conferences, in boardrooms, or over radio waves, carried the weight of a verdict. In the suburbs, identical houses lined up neatly, as if measured by the same ruler. In the morning, a man in a white shirt and tie stepped out the door, leather briefcase in hand. In the evening, he returned on time, the soft rumble of cars outside, a door opening, the smell of grilled meat, children's laughter. At the dinner table, stories of war slowly became distant, like a storm that had crossed the ocean and would never return. In the living room, a small television showed images of American soldiers standing beside flags in places very far away. Strange names drifted by like constellations: Berlin, Seoul, Havana. But they lay beyond the safe frame of that family's window. The streets were still clean, the lawns still green, the stores still full. And children grew up surrounded by optimistic music, commercials promising the future, and the familiar reassurance of adults. Here, everything will be fine. Veterans came home. Not all carried shining medals. Some carried silence, an emptiness in their eyes, a reflexive flinch at sudden sounds. But there was too much to build, to buy, to dream. People preferred to look forward. They preferred to believe that wounds could be covered by neon lights and weekend vacations. In schools, world maps hung on the walls. America sat there large, clear, and solid like a promise. Teachers spoke of freedom, of opportunity, of the nation's role. Students took notes, eyes bright, as if history had already ended and what remained was simply the expansion of a dream. No one taught them to imagine fear crossing an ocean. No one taught them that power, too, has a price. And so, through summers and Thanksgivings, through snow-covered Christmases resting on rooftops, that belief grew calm, unquestioned, as natural as breathing. Americans grew up believing bad things only happen somewhere else. But then, Vietnam happened. At first, it was just a distant name on a map, a narrow strip of land, like a line of ink on the far side of the Pacific. In smoke-filled boardrooms, it was called a hotspot, a link, a test. On television, the evening news showed brief black and white clips: dense jungle, helicopters circling overhead, young soldiers in steel helmets staring into the camera with eyes that hadn't yet figured out where they were. In American suburbs, families still ate dinner under warm yellow lights. But sometimes, the telephone rang at the wrong moment. Sometimes, a white envelope appeared in the mailbox, government seal, unfamiliar signature, language too cold for tears. And sometimes, at the end of a quiet street, a military vehicle stopped and stayed too long in front of one house. People talked about the war the way they talked about the weather, far away, something that would pass. But Vietnam did not follow the script America knew. It didn't look like the heroic chapters in textbooks, where enemies were clear, battle lines straight, and victory measured by flags planted on hills. In Vietnam, the lines blurred like fog. Trees could protect or swallow you whole. A road that felt peaceful by day could become a trap at night. Young soldiers learned to walk without looking straight ahead, to listen to leaves, to fear silence more than gunfire. And the strangest thing was this: even when victories were announced, America did not feel like it was winning. Numbers appeared on the news, secured, pacified, pushed back, but at the same time, other images flooded living rooms, stretchers, helicopters lifting bodies in chaos, faces covered in mud, eyes hollow and distant. Television, the same device that once brought comedy shows and cheerful commercials, had become a window straight into a war with no fence around it. On college campuses, a generation began to ask questions, not small ones. Questions powerful enough to shake foundations. What are we doing there? Marshes filled the streets. Signs were raised high. Chants thundered through the air. Families argued at dinner tables, fathers' voices burning with anger, children's voices sharp as blades. Some homes flew flags to prove their patriotism. Others took them down, unable to live with the contradiction. And in between were mothers who wanted only one thing: their children back, whether in uniform or in any form that still breathed. Soldiers returned carrying the smell of jungle, the smell of smoke and sleepless nights. Some came home in silence, sitting on front porches, staring into the distance as if helicopter blades were still spinning somewhere inside their heads. Some returned and no longer fit into ordinary life. Fireworks on holidays made them flinch. A slamming door tightened their chests. Some stopped speaking altogether, because if they spoke, everything would pour out like a flood. America, a nation that once believed every war led to a clear ending, began to realize that some wars do not end in victory. They end in exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of muscles, but the exhaustion of belief. And then the final years arrived like a slow-motion film. Endless news reports, political promises, briefings, numbers, and after it all, a moment when the entire country seemed to hold its breath. Images of withdrawal, images of chaos, images of a departure unlike any triumphant return ever told before. It was not simply a military defeat. It was the first psychological shock. Because for the first time, America lost a war and didn't understand how it had lost. The morning of September 11th, the sky over New York was an unusually clear blue, the kind of late summer blue that makes people believe today will be just another ordinary day. People left their homes with coffee in hand, moving quickly through familiar streets. Inside high-rise buildings, elevators moved up and down in steady rhythm. Phones rang. Printers hummed. No one knew that time itself was about to fracture. Not a battlefield, not a border, New York, the financial center. A symbol of power, a place America believed would always be safe. 8:46 a.m., a strange sound tore through the air, not thunder, not any engine people recognized. Then impact. An explosion. Fire and smoke burst from the tower's side like a deep open wound. People on the streets looked up, not yet understanding what had just happened. Some thought it was an accident. Some stood frozen. Some ran. Some raised cameras. No one had words for that moment. Less than 20 minutes later, the sky roared again. The second plane slammed straight into the other tower, no hesitation, no deviation. And in that instant, the world understood. This was not an accident. This was a message. In just a few seconds, America lost the thing that had shielded it for decades, the belief that fear always lived far away. Black smoke rose like a cloud that refused to fade. Papers drifted down like snow. Fire alarms screamed in desperation. Those trapped inside looked out through windows at a sky still blue, unchanged while the path back to the ground had vanished. Below, firefighters charged into the smoke. Police shouted evacuation orders. Bystanders covered their mouths, tears falling before they could be wiped away. Then one tower began to shake. Not with a violent blast, but with a deep, heavy sound, as if the city itself had exhaled its final breath. The tower collapsed in seconds, taking with it thousands of lives, millions of unanswered questions, and a deadly silence that spread across America. People watched it on television live. No background music. No commentary to soften the blow. Only smoke, dust, screams, and panic flooding living rooms from coast to coast. Children were pulled out of classrooms. Flights were grounded. Bridges were closed. A nation froze, as if someone had pressed pause. Then the second tower fell. That collapse didn't just crush steel and concrete. It crushed a quiet but deeply rooted belief that oceans were walls, that power was a shield, that here was different from somewhere else. In that moment, America realized there's no place immune to fear. In the days that followed, the city was covered in gray dust. Walls filled with photos of the missing smiling faces staring back, as if still believing they would be found. Candles burned through the night. Flags flew at half-staff. Strangers embraced one another. And a single question echoed in silence. How could this happen? 2 towers fell. And at the same time, America's illusion of invulnerability fell with them. From that day on, America changed. Not overnight, but through small details that slowly seeped into everyday life, things that had once been invisible. At airports, lines grew longer, shoes came off, liquids were left behind. Security officers' eyes lingered harder, longer, as if searching for something they couldn't quite name. Metal detectors beeped, and with that dry mechanical sound, a different era began. Security, fear, suspicion. They didn't arrive loudly. They arrived quietly, in the way people looked at one another on subway cars, in the question, "Where are you from?" In the extra beat of silence before an answer. Buildings were reinforced. Roads gained barriers. Cameras appeared on street corners, silently watching like eyes that never slept. Americans learned to live with color-coded warnings on television screens. Red, orange, yellow, blue. Colors that had once meant nothing now measured levels of unease. Children grew up learning emergency procedures in school drills where sirens were no longer a game. Adults carried worry the way they carried keys and wallets. Small, contained, but impossible to leave behind. Conversations grew quieter. Humor survived, but more carefully. Stories about freedom were still told, but now came with conditions, exceptions, and small asterisks at the bottom of the page. People accepted measures they had never imagined before, not entirely because they wanted to, but because they feared losing something greater. New wars began, in distant places with unfamiliar names. On screens, maps lit up again. But this time, each dot wasn't just strategy, it was a reminder that borders no longer guaranteed safety. Each news report wasn't just information, it was a question. Is today safe? In quiet homes, doors were locked more carefully. In big cities, police presence grew heavier. And inside each person, a space quietly opened, not large enough to call despair, but deep enough to call loss. Something had left without saying goodbye: innocence. And though America remained standing, kept moving forward, kept speaking of hope, every step carried a little more weight. Freedom was no longer unconditional. Trust was no longer whole. American history is not just a story of power. From a distance, people often see numbers: GDP, military strength, influence, authority. They talk about victories, inventions, soaring skyscrapers, and dreams so vast they seem limitless. But history, when examined closely, is rarely written by power alone. It is written in the moments when people are forced to pause and acknowledge the one thing they least want to admit. It is a story about learning how to live. After illusions collapsed, America did not disappear. It woke up. Slowly, awkwardly, and no longer as confident as before. People began to understand that power is not absolute armor, that oceans are not walls, that history is never finished. It returns in different forms. At different moments, often when we least expect it. America learned to live with memory, with names carved in stone, with questions that refuse simple answers. It learned to live with contradiction, to believe in ideals, yet doubt itself, to want to lead the world, yet fear losing its footing. Debates grew louder, but also more honest. Agreement came less easily. And perhaps that, too, was a sign of a society coming of age. After realizing this, that power does not cancel pain, that freedom is not immune to loss, that great decisions leave scars, not only in distant places on a map, but inside families, inside generations. Americans learned to ask questions about war, about security, about the price of safety. Those questions did not make the nation weaker. They made it more real. We can be hurt too. And in that moment, when a nation becomes brave enough to admit its own fragility, history changes its voice. It is no longer a simple heroic anthem. It becomes a complicated story, with missteps, with regret, with the effort to stand again. A story where strength does not lie in never being struck, but in the ability to keep moving forward after the fall. And perhaps that is the moment America becomes most human,